Començarem aquesta nit amb un convidat, un medievalista que ha nascut, un català que ha nascut a Alemanya i que ha estudiat filosofia i s'ha decantat per l'estudi. Una de les coses que ha estudiat és el nostre teòleg i pensador Ramon Llull. Benvingut, Alexander Fidora.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to iCatalunya. I'm pleased to be here. As Patricia said, in a certain way, I am a newcomer to Catalonia since I was born and grew up in Germany, received my academic training at the University of Frankfurt, where I also taught for some years before joining the Institució Catalana de Recerca i Estudis Avançats and the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. On the other hand, and also this Patricia mentioned, I could also be described rather than as a newcomer, as a homecomer, since my mother is from Catalonia, so that we always had strong family ties with Catalonia and the Catalan territories. Even though I have to confess that at home we didn't speak any Catalan, or not very much Catalan. Only in very precarious, very difficult moments when my brother or I behaved in a very nasty manner, then my mother would switch to her native tongue, to her real mother tongue, and would shout at us in Catalan. So the first contact with Catalan language was not a very positive one, as you can imagine, però he superat el trauma. Anyhow, whether old or new Catalan, my research and my research projects, as well as my life, are now based since 2006 in Catalonia. And today I would give you some ideas or some insights into what these research projects are about. In very general terms, I'm doing research in the field of medieval studies, and particularly, more particularly, I'm looking into the transmission of both philosophical and theological knowledge during the Middle Ages between Jews, Christian, and Muslims. This sounds very vague at a first glance, so let me give you a more precise example of what we are doing. Since last year, since October of last year, we are doing research in a research project that is funded by the European Research Council on the Latin Talmud and its influence on Jewish-Christian polemic during the Middle Ages. The Latin Talmud, or the project itself, is about the discovery, one has to say, and the use of the Talmud, which is the biggest post-biblical Jewish corpus. So it's rabbinic teachings after the Bible that are collected and which regulate every aspect of daily Jewish life. This has been translated into Latin in the 13th century under very strange circumstances. First, in 1239, a Jewish convert, Nicolas Donin, addressed Pope Gregory with a collection of passages that he translated from the Talmud and which he considered offensive with regard to Christian religion, and in particular with regard to Jesus, who is said to be burning in excrements in hell, or to the Virgin Mary, for which they have nasty names in there, as Nicolas Donin tells us. The Pope reacts immediately, because the Church can be speedy in under certain circumstances, and writes to the kings all over Europe to tell them to confiscate the Talmud and to examine the Talmud. In French, this leads in 1240 to a trial against the Talmud, and in 1241, the Talmud is publicly burned at the Place de la Grève in Paris, in the center, in the heart of Paris. This was, however, not the end of the Talmud affair during the Middle Ages, because, curiously enough, after condemning and then burning the Talmud, the Christian authorities decided that it might be useful to translate the Talmud and to see what they actually condemned and burned. This came a bit late, but even so, in 1244, they translated large portions of the Talmud. 1,800 passages actually were translated into Latin by Christian theologians of that time, which mark a turning point in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, since they show that Christians became aware of something that is even today many times forgotten in Jewish-Christian encounters, namely the fact that just in a very similar way as for the Christians, the Old Testament is completed by the New Testament, so also the Jews do not only rely on the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, but this is supplemented by and complemented by the Talmud. This is an important insight which even today is often forgotten in Christian approaches towards Judaism. So what we do, in essence, is to edit this important corpus and to make it accessible for readers. We will also translate it, so to see what happened in the mid of the 13th century. This is, I think, an important contribution not only to preserving cultural heritage in general terms, but actually it is also a step, maybe only one step, but a step towards doing justice to past generations and preparing ourselves for the present and the future. In the sense that with this edition that we are preparing and translation, we raise awareness of and we try to come to terms with a very difficult chapter in European history, that is minority policies in the Middle Ages. This is one out of several research lines that I'm pursuing, and I guess that in our discussion we can also touch upon others, just like Ramon Llull, who is celebrating, or we are celebrating this year, his 700th, not anniversary, but the 7th centenary of his death, which will give way to many acts and celebrations in Barcelona. But I think that with this brief presentation, I have already given you some insight and some idea of what we are doing at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona.
Thank you, Alexander. Come here so we talk. So I wonder, this is really fascinating. How many people are involved in this research?
We have right now 2 postdocs at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. We will incorporate another 2 doctoral students, and we work closely together with people in Israel and in Germany who join us for longer periods at the Autònoma.
And how do you find, because you were saying there were passages that were censored in a way, how did you identify or find those passages that were censored? Where are they, or where?
Now, what is particularly interesting about the Latin Talmud is that precisely this Latin version preserves many of the passages that were later censored.
Oh.
Because they translated, of course, all the passages which they thought were particularly controversial and particularly offensive. And once they had translated them, the Christian censors could operate, and in manuscripts, but also in later editions of the Talmud, these passages were usually eliminated. So through the Latin Talmud translation, we have access to a layer of the original text, which in many editions, original Hebrew and Aramaic editions, is lost because of censorship.
And you are translating this or putting this into what language now?
We have, first of all, maybe I should have explained this before for those who are not so familiar with philological work and what critical editions are. Texts in the Middle Ages were extremely unstable because there was no printing, which means that texts were transmitted by copies, handwritten copies. And with every handwritten copy, the quality of what was transmitted went down. I mean, everybody knows this children game where you tell your neighbor something in a very low voice, and at the end, the result has very little to do with what the input was. The same happens in some cases with transmission in the Middle Ages. So our work is to gather the manuscripts. There are 10 at the moment. One is from Girona. And to compare word for word what they have, because sometimes there can be a knot which has been dropped and then the sense changes completely. Prepare an edition which gathers all these differences. That would be the critical edition, and establish the critical text. And then we want to prepare a translation to make this work accessible also for those who are not familiar with Latin.
So into English?
Into English, yeah.
Into English, interesting. And did you mention something about making justice with?
Yeah.
Explain a little bit more about
Well, I think that in general, cultural heritage and preservation of cultural heritage has a lot to do with doing justice to past generations, for instance. But in this particular case, I think that it stands out to everybody that this is the case. We are not just preserving cultural heritage for the sake of this cultural heritage, but because this has been part of a very dark chapter of European history in the Middle Ages, but which still has lots of relevance to our daily lives, in the sense that minority policies are still an important issue. And if you look at the way that the Talmud trial went, you see that many things went wrong. I told you, they condemned it, they burned it, and then they started examining it. So it's a strange sequence of events.
And when I was reading about you and when I found you, I was fascinated for what you do, because I thought it's very contemporary. I mean, it's very something that talks what you do, interreligious relationships, is something very contemporary. I mean, now that we are witnessing Islamophobia, with problems also against Jewish people, what do you think about it?
It is. I mean, you have to find the right balance. Of course, you cannot make an easy transfer and say that all these problems were already there and still persist in the same way, and that we have to go back to medieval sources to solve these problems. This would be, I think everybody agrees, a much too easy solution. But there is certain patterns and there is certain problems which have not been solved since then. As I said before, in Christian, even nowadays, in Christian approaches from Rome and other official authorities, one of the problems that Jews feel is that their exegetical tradition, the way that they read the texts, is not taken into consideration enough, because, for instance, the Talmud, which develops a lot of this exegesis, is not really taken into consideration by their interlocutors, because they do not acknowledge the status of this text as a semi-sacred text for the Jews.
Mm-hmm. But very interesting. Now, having you here, we have to talk about Ramon Llull.
Of course.
Especially because it connects you with Catalonia and also with this interreligious thing. Something that fascinates me about Ramon Llull is the fact that he did a real effort to understand other religions, even his idea was to convert them, but he really tried to make a rational effort to develop a methodology also.
Yeah, that's true. He is one of the few thinkers during the Middle Ages who not only wrote about mission and conversion, but who put it into practice, and who were willing to put their own lives into danger in order to stand up for their ideas. So he traveled to Africa, he traveled to Bejaia, he traveled to Tunisia.
And he learned the languages.
He learned
Arabic.
the languages, of course. He learned the languages,
also.
and he told everybody that he wanted to have a dialogue which was purely rational. He insisted on that. Neither Bible, nor Talmud, nor Quran, purely rational, he said. We just take those concepts, which are in the end philosophical concepts that are common to all religions. For instance, goodness, greatness, eternity. And we speak about these concepts. And we do it in a rational manner, without any reference to revealed texts and traditions. And he said, if we discuss these concepts, I'm willing, if you can convince me that these concepts fit better into an Islamic account of the world, I'm willing to convert. So he claimed, whether he would have done is another question, but he claimed that rationality, and that's important, I think, also nowadays, rationality requires reciprocity. Mm-hmm. You cannot tell somebody you have to accept the best argument, but not be willing to revise your own view in the light of the best argument. And that's something that Dewey insisted very much upon. Rationality means reciprocity. You have to put, it's not only the other's identity that is at stake, but it's also your identity. And you have to be willing to accept
if you are persuaded by the other.
Even if it's in detriment of your own convictions.
This is very important, should be applied nowadays, I mean.
This is an important insight.
Important insight.
But it's an insight which is very difficult, I think, to really carry out. It's easy as an ideology or as a conviction to be uttered at the beginning of religious dialogue, but then really to go into such a dialogue with this openness of saying, well, if they convince me, then I will change my essence. Or I will exchange my essence. Catalunya. No?
Yes, but this is really very nice, because, I mean, he was also not only developing this rational approach, but also he made a very conscious effort to get to know others before he started this process. So he, as I was saying, he learned Arabic. He wrote in Arabic. He wrote in Latin. He wrote in Catalan, of course.
Yeah, he was. This is also something which is rather unfrequent in medieval times and even nowadays, that you think of your public, you think of your audience, and he chose languages according to the public that he was targeting. And he wrote for different publics, not only for different religious publics, as you said, for which he would use Arabic on the one hand and Latin on the other. Hebrew he did not know, but he also wrote for children. And he wrote for women who by that time were in a desperately asymmetrical situation with regard to education. Women had no access to education in Latin. And so he wrote in Catalan for children, he wrote in Catalan for women, he wrote in Catalan also for a man audience, but he was very well aware of the fact that you have to get to your audience through language.
To adjust to them in a way.
Yeah.
To get to their level, because he was not writing in Latin or for the elites.
Yeah, exactly.
I have questions from people now. There's a question that says, where did your interest in studying the Talmud came from? Oh.
Because I cannot say that I really had a material interest in the Talmud as such. I'm not a Talmudist, which is a field of expertise which requires lots of training. I'm interested in these phenomena of transmission of knowledge in the Middle Ages, and to see how texts and ideas travel from one religious but also linguistic community to another, and how these transmission or how these texts then develop their own dynamics. And in the case of the Latin Talmud, one of the dynamics or one of the consequences it has is that it is actually the beginning of Christian Hebraism. That's the moment when Christians, for the first time, after many years or centuries, get again interested in Hebrew source texts, which also help them, and this is quite clear in Protestant theology until our days, which help them to redefine their own identity as Christians.
And I have another question. How do you think technology can help you to preserve all this heritage?
There's many projects, many ongoing projects, for instance, for digitizing manuscripts. You have to think that most of this medieval cultural heritage is preserved in manuscripts, which have been in libraries for centuries, but the quality of which, of course, does not get better, on the contrary. And so there have been important initiatives over the last years, decades, to digitize these texts so that even if they deteriorate, we will have these digital images that allow us both to preserve them, but also, and this is an important factor as well, to work on this text on a more international level. I will give you an example from Ramon Llull, since you asked before. At Freiburg, there is the Raimundos Lullos Institute of the University of Freiburg, where they prepare or they enhance the edition of his Latin works. Years ago, you had to go there and work there with microfilms. Now they have digitized everything. So you have researchers in Brazil who sit at home or in the universities.
Yeah.
You have researchers in Italy, you have researchers all over the place who work on these editions without having to travel.
And this would be the dream of Ramon Llull.
This makes, because he traveled a lot, and actually his last trip costed him his life. So maybe he would have preferred to do some of his work, not all, because he wanted personal contact through internet.
There is another question from somebody that says, how do you think technology? I think we are done with the questions from people, because also we are done with the time. But it had been very interesting, and we could be talking longer, but we will continue at the end.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander.
We always had strong family ties with Catalonia and the Catalan territories, even though I have to confess that at home we didn't speak any Catalan, or not very much Catalan. Only in very precarious, very difficult moments when my brother or I behaved in a very nasty manner, then my mother would switch to her native tongue, to her real mother tongue, and would shout at us in Catalan. So the first contact with Catalan language was not. I am a newcomer to Catalonia since I was born and grew up in Germany, received my academic training at the University of Frankfurt, where I also taught for some years before joining the Institució Catalana de Recerca y Estudis Avançats and the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. On the other hand, and also this Patricia mentioned, I could also be described rather than as a newcomer, as a homecomer, since my mother is from Catalonia, so that very positive one, as you can imagine, però he superat el trauma. Anyhow, whether old or new Catalan, my research and my research projects, as well as my life, are now based since 2006 in Catalonia. And today I would give you some ideas or some insights into what these research projects are about. In very general terms, I'm doing research in the field of medieval studies, and particularly, more particularly,
Començarem aquesta nit amb un convidat, un medievalista que ha nascut, un català que ha nascut a Alemanya i que ha estudiat filosofia i s'ha decantat per l'estudi. Una de les coses que ha estudiat és el nostre teòleg i pensador Ramon Llull. Benvingut, Alexander Fidora.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to iCatalunya. I'm pleased to be here. As Patricia said, in a certain way,